All right. Very good morning. Good morning, good morning. So glad to see each and every one of you this morning at Market Street Church of Christ here on this Sunday morning at our auditorium class. Understand Richard is not back yet, so welcome those Richard class attendees. We're glad to have you this morning. We are studying in this auditorium class the 15 periods of the Bible, where you can divide life into periods. There are those who have childhood, and then you have adulthood, and then seniorhood. You can divide it even more than that. You think about geology, archaeology, all the different periods of time. So that's the idea behind the periods of the Bible, because indeed there are time periods that are very definitive in the Bible. Now, some of those time periods, as you can see from the chart there, will lap over into various books. So, for example, we just studied the conquest of Canaan, and you'll see here in just a moment, it still kind of goes all the way into Judges, all the way up to about Judges chapter 3. And so each one of these, depending on the period we're talking about, some of the books handle them differently. So, looking at these time periods, this is our schedule we've been working on, and it turns out I will be here this coming Sunday. We have canceled our trip to Brazil to some unforeseen or undesirable circumstances, shall we say. And so I will be here this Sunday, but on November the 3rd, I will be traveling to go celebrate my dad's 80th birthday. So I will need a teacher for that day. If anybody's interested, let me know or let Chris Davis know. And then I'm not sure what we're going to do about the October 27th class. May have to just tack it on to the very end into the next quarter, because that's the weekend of the seminar, so we won't be having that class that day. We are studying this period. This is our 7th class on this, and we're studying the period of the Judges. And so a very interesting and fascinating period. As talking about periods or phases, you can also divide the Bible into 3 major ages or phases, if you will, and that being the patriarchal age, the Mosaical age, and the Christian age. So we're in that middle section when we're talking about these 15 periods. Those 15 periods fit within those ages, and as you can see from that round circle there, the Mosaical age, that represents an age, and within that, there's more circles, those are periods. And in my chart that I made, I have fewer periods than what is on the yellow section, which we're studying in this class. But you can see from those periods, notice that there's one here, then one up here, then one here. That's because that is a visual indication of a high point or a low point in the time of Israel. So during the wilderness was a low point because they were disobedient. The time of the conquest was a high point because they were obedient and God was with them. And we get into Judges and we're going to see it's a low point. You get back to the Kings, they get more united under Saul and David and even Solomon. It's a high point, and then after that it's a low point. And then you get into the ministry of Jesus. But you can also divide those, I have there 5 periods, into more, as you can see in those little yellow boxes. So we're looking at the Judges. So that phase, the Judges phase, is where we're at today, or this period of the Bible. So, having said all that, thinking about the book of Judges, this is a pretty simple one. When we're talking about this particular time period, it is about 350 years. But thinking of this time period, who are some of the principal personalities that come to mind whenever you think about the book of Judges? Who are some people that come to mind, the principal characters or personalities? Deborah, Gideon, Samson. Excellent, excellent. So, believe it or not, Joshua is still part of this book, because we're going to see in the first couple of chapters, he's still one of the personalities that's here. But I heard, so Deborah, we had Gideon, Samson, Ruth. Ruth is part of the period of Judges. When you think about the book of Ruth, while it's separate from the book of Judges, it takes place during the same time frame. And even the first part of the book of Samuel. Samuel is the last judge, and so he's a part of it. One of those other, you can't talk about the book of Judges without talking about all 15 of those judges, which we will address here in just a few minutes. So there's all 15 of them. And then some other characters, some other personalities that we might forget about or maybe don't remember their names. Like who can tell me who Jael is? Who is Jael?
She killed, nailed his head to the floor.
Sisera. There's Sisera right there next to her. Jael is a woman who nailed Sisera's head to the floor, put a tent peg through his temple, yes. How about Micah? Who knows who Micah is? That's an interesting, not Micah the prophet. This is a different Micah. We'll talk about him in just a moment. So there's several there that you might not recognize the names, but these are all people who are in the book of Judges, who all played a part in some fashion or another, whether they were part of the story or whether they were one of the judges or whether they were somebody who opposed, like Sisera, for example, who opposed the Israelites. So considering the judges, and I was afraid you probably wouldn't be able to read that, we have, 13 different judges. And so this chart is a pretty useful chart, and I'll try to redo that so that it's easier to see. But there's several things that you can take from each one of these judges. One is what tribe they're from. So they're all Israelites. They're all from various tribes. They all had a specific enemy or someone who they were fighting against, somebody who was oppressing the children of Israel. They all had a specific place, time frame. They also all had a specific amount of time in which they served. And so there are those that serve for just a very short while and some who serve for many, many years. And so we'll talk about that more in just a moment. Now, another aspect of the judges, when you look at just those judges, the time period of the judges, is some people will look at those judges and put them one right after another and try to put that time frame together with this judge served, and then this judge served, and then this judge served, and then this judge served. And that adds up to a lot more than 350 years. And so one of the things that we have to understand is the judges, some of the judges, served at the same time as another judge. And the best way to see this or recognize that is that there's areas. There's areas of Israel and various people who they were fighting against. For example, this should be an easy one. Who did Samson fight against the most? The Philistines. There you go. Whereas others fought against Moab or the Midianites, the Amalekites, various different peoples. And so depending on where they were, we call that, as you can see on the chart there that I drew, this is from a timeline that I did several years ago. The northern campaign, you have up in the northern areas people like Deborah and Isban and Elon and Abdon. Abdon's really more of a central campaign, I've since learned. Jephthah, he's out to the east of Israel. And then you have Gideon, who's right there in the middle, along with Tola and Jair. And then you have Samson to the west, out where the Philistines are. And then you have, in the southern campaign, you have Othniel, Shamgar, and Ehud. And so it helps to know that, as you can see right there, that Ehud served about the same time as Deborah. Shamgar right there in that same little bit of time frame. And then you have some that served one right after another, while at the same time, for example, Jephthah at the same time as Isban, Elon, and Abdon. When you do that, you can then get them all into that time period of 350 years. Joe Wilson, am I correct on that time of the Judges, 350? And with Joe Wilson's time frame, so one of the practices that I picked up from him, and I think is a very smart practice, is to write the dates of, he's got that time frame available. He's currently teaching the book of Exodus on Wednesday evenings, and he has a time frame, timeline that is available. And take those times and put them in the chapters of your book. So for example, in Judges chapter 2, I have 1380 BC, and then in the middle of chapter 3, whenever the Judges start, 1375 BC. It really does help a lot to know where you are in the time of the story of redemption. All right, any other thoughts, questions before we get into some of the wonderful stories and lessons of the book of Judges? All right, so opening your Bibles to Judges chapter 1, what we see is a couple of things happening in Judges chapter 1 and 2. The best way to understand this depends on the titles in your books and your Bibles, but the way that this is written, the one that I use, chapter 1 gives you the political background of what's happening in Israel. And then chapter 2 gives you the spiritual background of what's happening. And I think that's such a wonderful thing about the Bible. You'll see the same thing in the book of Kings. And 1st and 2nd Kings is talking about the political happenings of Israel, whereas 1st and 2nd Chronicles gives you the same time frame, but from a spiritual point of view. And again, that's so valuable because that is the way that human beings operate. We live and operate under governments, and there's political things that happen, but at the same time, there's a lot of stuff happening spiritually. We see that right here in America. So if you were to take both of those viewpoints at the history of America, you can see how things have changed, right? Religion used to be the most important thing, and politics was down here, and since it's kind of done this, hasn't it? Politics is now reigning king, whereas religion has been put down. So the same thing happened with Israel. So in chapter 1, you have after the death, verse 1, after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, who shall be first to go up for us against the Canaanites and fight against them? So what we're seeing here is a continuation of this period of the conquest. So last Sunday we talked about the conquest. Here it continues with what Joshua started in Joshua chapter 1, where they are conquering the land of Canaan. And in verse 12 you see Caleb. Caleb comes onto the scene. So Joshua has died, but here's Caleb still living, and he says, whoever attacks Kirjath-Sepher and takes it, him I will give my daughter Achsah as wife. So Caleb is still commanding to some degree his people. He's not the overall commander. And you see this where they continue with the conquest. However, we got a problem beginning in verse 27, which helps set up the whole book of Judges and what the problem is. Verse 27, however, so after all this stuff they're talking about, God was with the Israelites, they conquered all of these Canaanites, drove them out, and then took the land. Verse 27, however, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshan and its villages, or Taanach and its villages, and the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, and the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages, for the Canaanites were determined to dwell in that land. In other words, they were resisting strongly, and therefore the Israelites didn't do all that they should do. So, whenever the Israelites were strong, they put them under tribute, says verse 28. But then you go down, you see verse 30, Zebulun didn't drive out everybody. Verse 31, Asher didn't drive out everybody, nor did 33, Naphtali. So several of the tribes didn't finish driving out all these Canaanites. And then what winds up happening is they wind up staying in the land, which will have a bad effect on the Israelites. Whenever God, you see an example of this in 1 Samuel 15, I believe it is, whenever God told Saul to go and completely wipe out this one group, and he didn't do it. And then he brings back their king and some of the livestock, and in his mind, he had completely obeyed. And God says, no, through Samuel says what? Says obedience is better than sacrifice. So that's a lesson we see here. Obedience is what God wants. And the children of Israel did not fully obey God's commands. And it's going to come back, no pun intended, to bite them. It's going to come back on them bad. So that's the political aspect. Chapter 2, you get into the spiritual aspect. Then the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I led you up from Egypt and brought you to the land which I swore to your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And you, here's why, this is a problem. You shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars. This is why God is driving them out. Sometimes you might think, why is God being so mean and dislodging these people from their land? You know, in today's society, that's looked down upon, bad, very much so, right? Well, you got to back up into what God told Moses and others, that their iniquity was not yet full. In other words, he said that to Abraham, their iniquity was growing. God was fully aware of what was going on with all the Canaanites. And right here it is, their altars. They were evil people doing evil things, and God had enough. Which teaches us that God's patience has a limit. But, he says, verse 2, you have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? Now, if you look down verse 4, it says, the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the children of Israel, and they lifted up their voice and wept. They recognized spiritually they had sinned, they had done wrong. Verse 6, and when Joshua had dismissed the people, the children of Israel went to his own inheritance to possess the land. Wait just a minute. Didn't we just read in verse 1 of chapter 1 that Joshua died? Right? So this is what I mean by chapter 1 shows you a political picture, and now in chapter 2 we've backed up. So we're looking at the same time frame, but from a different point of view, and this is from a spiritual point of view. So Joshua is still alive. While Joshua was still alive, the people were already beginning to disobey. And so they disobey. Now we get to verse 8, Joshua died. So just to clarify, Joshua did not die twice. Okay? Joshua died one time, same event, two different points of view. He dies in verse 8, and then verse 10, one of the saddest verses, when all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation arose after them and did not know the Lord, nor the work which he had done for Israel. Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. And look what it says. What does your Bible say? And they served. How terrible. Now, I often paint this picture so people understand how this came about. It's easy to look back in the Bible and go, those silly Israelites, why did they do that? Or how could I would never do that? Really? Well, look at it this way. The Israelites had been wandering in the desert for 40 years, right? Did they know anything about building houses? Did they know anything about agriculture other than animals? They didn't know how to plant vineyards and do all the other things. In fact, God says when you go in, you're going to get houses you didn't build. You're going to get vineyards you didn't plant. You're going to get all these benefits, milk and honey that you didn't ever work for. And when you forget me, he says in Deuteronomy chapter 6. So now they get there. And what did they not do? They did not drive out all the Canaanites, right? So, do the Canaanites, they've lived there. Do they know how to grow stuff? Oh yeah, they've been doing it for ages and they're real good at it. That's just like our folks just north of us here that grow the cotton and peanuts and soybean and everything. I know a bunch of those. Some members of the church Matter of fact, Jeff's family has got some up there, and Mike and a few others. They're good at it. They know how to grow peanuts and stuff. So let's imagine that they've been here this whole time. They're Canaanites, and they give all the glory to Baal. They think the reason they're so good at it is because they pray to Baal and he sends the rain. Now here comes this Israelite, and he's trying to scratch out a living and plant some. It's like, man, my peanuts and my cotton and stuff just don't look near as good as yours. Hey, neighbor, what is it that you're doing that I'm not doing? And my neighbor says, oh, I pray to Baal. What are you going to do? Huh. Okay. It's not that you're giving up God. You still believe in God, but I need some help with my crops. So what do I got to do for this Baal guy? Oh, well, you got to go do this and do that. There's an altar over here and so forth. Okay. So I get my stuff. I go to that altar, and now you've just mixed God with all those other gods. You see why God said get rid of all of them? Because if they were all gone, and if all the altars were gone, and now I don't know how to grow peanuts or cotton, I can't go, hey, oh, it's just me. We got to figure this out. God, that's what they should have done, right? So it's easy to look at the Bible and say, oh, silly Israelites. But we got to understand, this is real people. These are real people, real events, real times, and real situations. And so here's how it mixes in. All right, so the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. Chapter 3, verse 7, they forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asherahs. Those are both gods of agriculture, of rain and fertility. So it makes sense why now they're doing this, but it doesn't make it right. All right, so then what would happen is God would raise up a judge. Verse 9, when the children of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the children of Israel who delivered them. And we have the first one is Othniel. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. So here's our first judge, and he comes and he serves. And then you have, after that, in verse 12, yet another judge. So first we have Othniel. He reigns for several years. And then we have another one. We have Ehud. Ehud is a judge that God raises up because Moab started oppressing and taking stuff and going after the children of Israel, Eglon, the king of Moab. And so they wound up serving this king because he had more power. That's one of the things you see over and over and over. In fact, one of the things that it says in the book of Judges is that at that time there was no king in Israel. That means that somebody wrote this looking back on this through inspiration from a time like there is a king in Israel, which would be Saul or David. So it's most likely Samuel wrote these. And he's looking back going, there was no king back then to take care of stuff. So people would wind up serving somebody like this Eglon, king of Moab. And so God would raise up this judge. Now in the case of Ehud, does anybody know the story of Ehud and some interesting characteristics of this man, of this judge? What do we know? He's left-handed. He's a southpaw, as we say, right? He's left-handed. Is that right? Am I saying that right, you baseball fans? Southpaw. He's left. What does that matter? What difference does it? Why would the Bible talk about somebody who's left-handed?
When the guards of King Eglon went to search him, they only searched his left side because a right-handed man, predominantly a right-handed man at that time, would have reached to their left to draw a sword. And so they only searched there, like, no dagger, no sword, led him inside to see the king, and didn't check where a left-handed man would store a weapon.
There we go. So TSA is predated by these people, right? So, as he said, he's left-handed. So that means, for example, a lot of people, even today, when they carry guns or weapons, they're going to put it on this side, especially detectives and stuff. They have their guns so they can reach in with their right hand. Same way with you're going to pull a sword, it's going to be on this side. Well, he's left-handed. It's on this side. And they went to search him. He didn't have it on that side, so he was able, it was a dagger that he fabricated to take in to see. I need to see the king about some business. And so he goes in to see this king. What was the shape of the king? He was a big boy, wasn't he? He was a very big boy. And so, so what winds up happening is Ehud says, King, I got a secret to tell you. I need you to tell everybody to leave. And so he has everybody leave the chambers, which is crazy to think in the first place, right? And he goes up to him and he pulls out that knife and he puts it in, and it says, this is gross, it says the fat overcovered the whole knife. He had to leave it in, and his entrails fell out. And then Ehud escapes out the window, locks the thing, so whenever the guards come, they could smell something. And they're like, oh, I guess he's just taking care of business in there. Really interesting, a lot of interesting detail, right? Now, why does that matter? Why do we need to know all that stuff? It shows you the reality and the reliability of the Bible, because it tells you these kind of details that shows that even through inspiration, the Holy Spirit was there, witnessed all those things, and then if Samuel is the one that wrote this, gave him all that information to be able to set such detail. That is a sign of inspiration. Make sense? All right, so God would raise up a judge whenever Israel would cry out, and then what would wind up happening is they would serve that judge, or they would be protected under that judge, and then the judge would die, and then Israel would fall back into sin. So what we have is this cycle of disobedience, or cycle of judges. And so over and over, the entire book of Judges is about this cycle. You have Israel being oppressed by somebody. They are in sin. They cry out to God. God raises up a judge. That judge will then drive out all of the oppressors. They'll be able to live, and he'll rule in peace. He dies, and then the cycle starts all over again. This is what you see over and over and over throughout the book of Judges. And then also, can't really see that real clear, but there's the land of Israel. And I mentioned to you that you can see where they are as far as a northern campaign, southern campaign, and so forth. And I find it interesting that even when you go online, there's still some discrepancies. There's still not paying close attention, because right there on this one, this morning I was studying this, and they have Shamgar way up there in the top. Well, look in your Bibles in chapter 3, all right? That says chapter 3, verse 31. All right, so now we get into the next judge. All right, one verse. This man's life is summarized in one verse in the Bible. He was a judge in Israel. After him was Shamgar, the son of Anath, who killed 600 men of the Philistines with an ox goad, and he also delivered Israel. All right? So why is that important? Why am I showing you that? Well, where do they have Shamgar placed on this map? Way up north. And whenever I was telling you earlier about how some of these judges ruled at the same time, because there would be somebody like Deborah, who's up in the northern campaign, it says that. She's up there in the valley in that northern valley up there. And it just says right here, who was Shamgar fighting against? The Philistines. Philistines weren't up in that part of Israel. They were down south. And so it just goes to show that even on something like this, you got to be careful. Make sure you study and understand where they are, what time frame, and things like that. All the different things like what Joe's been talking about on Wednesday night. So Shamgar does not belong up there in the northern part. He's way down there on the south with the Philistines. Okay, so now we get into Deborah. So we have Ehud. So chapter 4, verse 1. When Ehud was dead, the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. There's that cycle. Started over. And this time you have Jabin, the king of Canaan, who is making trouble for everybody. And then Sisera, who also is making trouble. So verse 3, the children cried out to the Lord. And they were oppressed, it says here, for 20 years. He harshly oppressed the children of Israel. Now, verse 4, Deborah, prophetess, wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at the time. Here we have a woman. And so one of the other things that's wonderful about the Bible is that it always paints women or portrays women in their rightful place. During this time frame, women did not have hardly any rights or anything, were not regarded in any way like they are today. And yet, here we have a woman who is a judge, as well as we see how Jesus talks about women in the New Testament and everything else. And so, here we have a woman judge who not only did a great job, but then you see in chapter 5, there's a whole song written about her because she was such a wonderful judge. And she was a prophetess. Now, what is a prophetess? A woman prophet. So you think about Isaiah and Jeremiah and all these others. Well, Deborah was in that same category. She prophesied through inspiration through the Lord. So she seeks out some help, and she seeks out Barak, and says to Barak in verse 8, Barak said to her, if you will go up with me, then I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go. So they form a partnership. Yes, Deborah, I will fight for you if you go with me. She goes with him. And then we get into this incredible story where Barak and Deborah go up and they fight against the Canaanites. And here we see Sisera who is fighting. And so they go into the valley of Jezreel there. It's such a beautiful, beautiful place. I wish I had one of my pictures from the valley of Jezreel. It is a nice wide valley that on both sides you have mountains going up, but it's this nice long wide valley. It is full of agricultural plains of all kinds of things. That's where they grow a lot of food even to this day. And off in the distance you can see some of the mountains and everything. And so it is in that area that here come all these chariots. And here comes Deborah to meet them. And God intervenes and causes mud to be so thick that their chariots became useless. So chariots are a fearful thing. If you're on foot and all you have is a sword and a shield, and here comes a chariot, that'd be like going up against a tank in our modern warfare. And so those chariots became useless whenever they're bogged down in the mud. So what winds up happening is they wind up getting routed. Israel winds up defeating them. Well, then the leader, Sisera, takes off. He tries to escape. And one of the most interesting stories in all the Bible, it says that Sisera takes off. Verse 18, we'll pick up there. And Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, turn aside, my Lord, turn aside to me, do not fear. When he had turned aside with her into the tent, she covered him with the blanket. Then he said to her, please give me a little water to drink, for I'm thirsty. So she opened a jug of milk. That's interesting. A jug of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him. In other words, put a blanket on him. And he said to her, stand at the door of the tent, and if any man comes and inquires of you and says, is there a man here, you shall say no. So, okay, I find this rather interesting. You're in the middle of this battle, right? And all of a sudden your army is getting beat, and you realize, whoa, I better get out of here. So you take off on foot, and you run away, and you come to this tent, and you go, hey, can I get in here and hide? This woman apparently says, come on in, it's okay. And then you're going to lay down and take a nap. I don't know, not exactly the smartest strategy of a military leader that I can think of, right? Well, he pays for it with his life, because as he goes to sleep, Jael takes a tent peg. All right, so she didn't have a weapon, she didn't have a knife, she didn't have anything else, takes a tent peg, and of all places, hammers it into his temple, right here. Basically nails his head to the floor. Very strange story, right? But here we go. So that's how the children of Israel overcame, and then they sing this song of Deborah. Then we get into one of the most famous judges of the book, and that is Gideon. Who can tell me a little bit about Gideon? He was a coward at the beginning, that's right. He was a coward. How so was he a coward? He was hiding because the Midianites were oppressing them, so he was threshing wheat or threshing in a cave, if you will, when the angel of the Lord comes to him. What else do we know about Gideon?
He wants to see a sign of the Lord before he do anything.
Yeah, how do I know that? Because the Lord comes to him and says, mighty man of valor, you're going to serve me. And he goes, man of valor? Don't you know who I am? I'm nobody. And he goes, if it's really true, give me a sign. And so he shows a sign to him. So then what happens after that? What's some more about Gideon that you remember? It's a great story.
He's never satisfied at the beginning. He wants him to keep proving himself.
Keep what? Keep proving himself, yeah. So then God says, you're going to gather an army and we're going to go fight these. And he says, oh, well, okay, if you really want me to be the leader, then he wants another sign. Does anybody remember what that sign is? The fleece. What is a fleece? Sheepskin. It's just a bunch of wool, right? He says, Lord, I'm going to put this down, and if it is dew in the morning, if it's not on there but dew on the ground, then I'll believe. And that's exactly what happened. Then he's like, well, wait a minute. That could happen because there are sometimes, dew's not going to fall. Okay, can I do it again? Lord, he wants a do-over. The same sign. This time, if there's only dew on the fleece and not on the ground, I'll know. And it happened exactly the way he asked. So 3 times he asked for a sign. And finally, okay, Lord, I guess you want me to do this. So he gathers, or he calls out, and some people come. 32,000 people show up to help Gideon go fight the Midianites. And God says what to him? That's enough? Oh, too many. And so he says, okay, Lord. So he goes to him and he says, all right, any of you who do not want to serve, all right, so we look here. Got to find this. There we go. Whoever is fearful and afraid, let him turn and depart. 22,000 people returned and 10,000 remained. Okay, we're good to go. We got 10,000 people. God says that's enough, right? Still too many. So now God gives a test, and he says, I want you to have all those men go and get a drink of water. And the ones who bend over like this and drink like a dog, I guess you could say, versus the ones who bend down and lift it up like this, I want you to get rid of the ones who bend down like a dog. And there's a reason for that, partially, is that if you're a true military man, you're not going to put your head down where you're not aware of what's going on. Instead, you're going to be drinking, making sure you're not being attacked. But 300 against thousands, which, by the way, Andrea just got back from Greece, and she was over in the area of Thermopylae, where the Spartans defeated or held the Medo-Persians back. It's a famous battle. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? All right. And there was do not recommend the movie, but there was a movie called 300. All right. It was about those Spartans and everything. It was a pretty famous movie. Well, they kept referring to the movie. So Andrea's asking me about the movie, and she's like, I guess I'm going to have to watch that movie. And I said, oh, no, we're not. We're not watching that movie. Well, here's 300 that far outdates Thermopylae. God's 300 is far greater than the 300 at Thermopylae. That was a great battle, but this is an even greater battle. Why? Because God does a thing like what he did at Jericho. Greatest battle plan you can imagine, just like Jericho. Go around it and shout and blow trumpets. All right? What a battle plan. But when you got God on your side, it works, doesn't it? This time, they get around them, and they have some torches that are covered over, and whenever Gideon gives the sign, they take the torch, they uncover the torches, and they shout out, the fear of the Lord. Am I saying that right? What is it they say to him? When they shout out, the Lord shall, where is it? It's right in front of me, and I can't find it. Lifted their heads. Do. Say again? 18. The sword of the Lord. There you go. And so when they did that in the middle of the night, all of those soldiers, they jump up and they start killing each other because they're confused of what's going on. They thought they was completely surrounded. So God provides the victory. Then Gideon goes on to rule over them, but unfortunately, Gideon winds up sinning and makes an idol, essentially. It's a sad ending. We're running out of time, so I'm going real fast. You have Abimelech's conspiracy. So one of Gideon's children, the illegitimate child, winds up deciding he wants to be king, and he winds up getting a bunch of people behind him. And again, another interesting story. He goes up to attack this tower, and this woman throws a millstone out and crushes his head. End of Abimelech. Then you have Jephthah. Who can tell me about Jephthah? What's Jephthah famous for?
Vowing to sacrifice the first thing that came out of his house.
An irrational vow. Lord, if you'll give me victory over these people, I will sacrifice to you whatever first thing that walks out the door of my house. Kind of a weird vow. I don't know about you, but I'm thinking I would have said barn maybe instead of house. But so whenever he is given the victory, he comes home, and the first thing that walks out of his house was who or what? His daughter. So there's all kinds of theological questions about what happened there. And then I think most people are pretty familiar with Samson and Delilah, the story of Samson. Samson had a weakness, and his weakness was not. So what was Samson's real weakness? Was it cutting his hair? Trick question. The real weakness was women, wasn't it? Because twice he gave in to a woman who was not being very truthful with what it is she wanted. And then I wish we had time to talk about Micah's idolatry. Micah was a man who brought in a priest, built an idol and everything else, and then whenever he was questioned about it, he even admitted that he made it. And then you have the Levite's concubine. I'm going to leave you to read that one for yourself. Pretty gnarly story. And then, of course, you have a civil war that results of all of that with the Benjamites and the Ephraimites and Sibboleth, where they couldn't say it, and that wound up in the death of several people. Very interesting to read. And then, as I mentioned, the story of Ruth and the first few chapters of 1 Samuel are all part of this period of the Judges. Highly recommend you just sit down and read the book of Judges this week. It won't take you long, but it will definitely give you some insight into the way our mighty God works. Any last questions, thoughts, comments? All right, thank you so much for your attention. We're going to take a break for our worship service.